Good morning. Happy 4th of July. And welcome to Margaret being Margaret. I'm having a nostalgic day. You know, this is the time of year where you hear so much patriotic music in it. It really touches me, and I've just decided I'm a patriot. A patriot is someone who fiercely believes and will defend their country. And I am one of those people who would, in a heartbeat, give my life for this country. Now, I think it's important. I don't think this country is perfect. I don't think this country is even close to perfect. It never has been, never will be. I was looking back at what has happened in my lifetime. Now, I have to go back a little further just because I have to. I was born in 1954. That was 9 years after the end of World War II. And it was still fresh. And I felt it. 10, 15 years later, I felt it. It was tangible. I remember the trepidation that my parents felt. I remember that uneasy feeling. And that's happened throughout my lifetime. It's part of the world. In 1950 to 53, there was the Korean War. So that had just happened too. There was a lot going on. And when we talk about how bad things are now, I am not discounting that. I'm as concerned as everybody else, maybe more concerned than a lot, but it's nothing that hasn't been part of our history. Times get tough, and it's up to us to make them better. And I think that's what I'm taking away from my upbringing. My parents knew they had to make it better. Nobody was going to do it for them. And then right after the Korean War, the Vietnam conflict started, which turned into a real war for 21 years. I grew up with that as a backdrop. I grew up with listening to that in the news. And I grew up in the time where you had TV, in our case black and white, and a couple of channels. And the evening news was really the only source of news you got. I remember the TV being on and being a child, but paying attention to how my parents were reacting to things. And you could see the stress on their faces. It's a tough world, always was. Now the world is smaller because of technology. So we get bombarded constantly with every corner of the globe that's in turmoil. When I was growing up, for the most part, the turmoil was only what was in our own backyard. Didn't mean it wasn't going on everywhere. It wasn't part of our daily existence. I was 21 when the Vietnam War ended. I remember our guys being drafted. They weren't 5, 10 years older than I was. I remember people dying in the Vietnam War. I remember how contentious it was and how divided the country was, which I never understood, because if we were someplace we didn't belong, we should have come home. That's a child's easy thinking. And knowing that our boys were being killed and nobody seemed to care stayed with me. It stayed with me throughout my adult life. I remember 1959, which means I was 5 years old. But again, listening to the radio, listening to TV. I remember Alaska and Hawaii being made states. And it's not something I remember from history. I remember that happening. I remember the look of pride and joy on my father and mother's faces, and my aunt and uncle having a vested interest in what was going on in the world. And then my big memories start around 1961. And again, I was only 7 years old, but that's when the Bay of Pigs happened. I remember the tangible fear in my parents' and my aunt and uncle's faces. I remember them standing in front of the TV. I remember being shushed when I tried to speak, and the relief after them pacing back and forth and talking about World War III, and the relief of the end of the standoff. I remember the speech from President Kennedy. I was 9 when he died. And if it's not a clear memory, it's been banged into my head so many times when President Kennedy said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." I'll cry. I remember being 9 years old in 1963 when President Kennedy was killed. I remember it so clearly. We were in school and all the teachers were crying. And they wouldn't tell us what had happened. We had to get on the buses and go home so our parents could tell us. And our parents were crying. It was a time of such upheaval. And it was one of the times when the whole world came together, which only seems to happen in crises, which is a shame because we're all in it together. I was 14 years old in 1968 when Robert Kennedy was killed and Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. When you felt like the whole world was going to hell in a handbasket. It's a feeling that our country and our people and people across the world have had for generations. The trials and tribulations change. Fear doesn't. I was 17 years old when Kent State happened. Just at the beginning of my lifetime of being a young adult and wondering what was wrong with the world. It's not new. In 1974, I was 20. I was already married for a couple of years when Nixon resigned. And we had the whole fiasco of the shame of his presidency. So in the first 20 years of my life, there was constant turmoil within this country. It hasn't changed since then. There's always going to be something happening. There's always going to be another problem on the horizon. Every problem is a big problem. Every crisis is a true crisis. And looking at today, I think it's so important that we take a minute to understand the difference between being patriotic to our country and our flag and being patriotic to the people who run the country. It's two different things. I'm a patriot. I will die for this country, first one in line. I will be the first one in line also to say that our leadership sucks. But it's about our country. We pledge allegiance to our flag, not the people who run the country. We respect the offices, not the people in office. We've got to make that distinction. You know, I was brought up at the end of the Depression. The memories were still there to take care of those around you, to appreciate what you have. I think we have to hold on to that. I think we have to bring it back. And how do we do that? We start by speaking up. We start by showing it. We start by just saying it. I don't care where you are in the world. I hope you're proud of where you live. I hope you're proud of what you stand for. And if you aren't, I hope you change it. Because nobody else can. It's up to us. We have so much wrong with our country, and we have so much to be proud of. The strife will never change. It's part of history, it's part of life. We don't have to let it define us. Just speak up. Stand proudly and defend this country, not the people running it. I am so proud to be an American. You know, my mom lived in Germany through the war. And when she came here, she didn't talk about it much, but it was like pulling teeth to get little things out of her. And I think it made me realize how lucky I was, because her life was tough. To live under the constant falling of bombs, to live in a blackout your whole teenage years, to be forced to go to work at 14 in a factory, in a kitchen where they amputated limbs and the smell permeated your lungs, to walk home in a blackout and fall into the ditches on the side of the road because it was so dark you couldn't see and you were 14 years old, to not have food on your table, to constantly be looking over your shoulder, to go to school one day and find out that your best friend's parents were gone because when you went to school as an 8, 10, and 12-year-old, you had to report what your parents had said at the dinner table the night before. And if you weren't conscious of what you said, your parents disappeared. I remember those stories even though she told them so seldomly. And I remember as a child being so grateful that my circumstances were better. And my circumstances weren't good. We all struggle. Life's a struggle, no matter where you live. But today is the day for us to celebrate our country. And I think when you celebrate, you have to take some responsibility for where we are, for where we're going, and step up with pride for what you will and you won't stand for. I love the United States. Happy 4th of July.